Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Dylan Kugler from the Starknet Foundation, and today I'm excited to be introducing a brand new program that we're running called Terraforming Web3. It's our first session, and we'll be covering building games in a post-Web2 world. We're joined by two incredible speakers who will talk a bit about a bold new vision for gaming. So thank you, Rich. Thank you, Terrence, for taking the time to speak to everyone here. Before jumping in, I want to briefly introduce why we are excited about this program. Now is the best time to build a game. The gaming industry is at a turning point. Technology, market trends, and player expectations are aligning in a way that we've never seen before. The shift isn't just about better graphics or new gameplay mechanics. It's about fundamentally rethinking how games are owned, played, and sustained. So looking back, gaming has always evolved in distinct waves. We've seen the rise of arcade gaming, home consoles, online multiplayer, and mobile games. And each phase has unlocked new possibilities and expanded the gaming frontier. And today, we stand on the verge of the next major shift, that of Web3 games. So really, thank you all for being here, and welcome to Terraforming Web3. This is a program to bridge the gap between Web2 and Web3 gaming. The evolution of blockchain, particularly rollups and scalability solutions like Starknet, has really unlocked possibilities that were previously not possible. And my perspective here, and I hope to share it with all the people from Web2, is that these advancements are not just incremental improvements. They actually represent a fundamental shift in how games are built, played, and sustained. But innovation isn't just about technology. It's about people. And right now we see an unmatched level of enthusiasm in this community. Builders, developers, and players who believe in this vision are actively shaping the future of gaming. So just briefly, before jumping into some of the panels and talks, the goal of this program is to bring key insights to both sides on this page. For Web2 professionals, we'll cover Web3 fundamentals, blockchain, NFTs, fully on-chain gaming, marketing strategies, and monetization in the crypto world. For Web3 professionals, we focus on scaling their projects with Web2 best practices, mastering the indie game lifecycle, and refining practical skills in game design, programming, and asset creation. Ultimately, our goal is to help both groups build games that appeal to both Web2 and Web3 audiences. This program runs as an online webinar over 6 weeks with one session per week. Our first session, from Web2 to Web3, that's today, sets the foundation for the entire program. So please welcome our first speaker for today, Rich Metzen. Rich is the founder and CEO of Archetypal Tech, a gaming studio building multiple fully on-chain games with a key focus on composable IP that allows communities to extend and create network effects around the games they love. Rich has a rich history of building and shipping games in the Web2 and Web3 world, and we'll be discussing where Web2 gaming is today. Afterwards, we'll follow with Terrence Van Ness, the co-founder and CEO of Cartridge. Cartridge is a comprehensive, fully on-chain gaming infrastructure platform on Starknet and a major player behind many games building on Starknet today. Terrence will be presenting on generational games. So let's just kick it off with a fireside chat with Rich. Perfect. So maybe we can just jump in. Rich, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Perfect. So it's great to have you here today. Before we jump in, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? What's your story, and how did you first get into gaming?
Yeah, so I've been in video games professionally for just over 16 years, going on 17 years. And I've run an independent game studio for 11 of those. My first move into games was from the visual effects industry. And actually before that, you can see with my profile photo, I was actually a welder. I used to weld fine art and sculpture for some of the world's top fine artists. That's going on nearly a quarter century ago, though. So we'll stick with the stuff that's a bit closer. So I moved from visual effects. London has a very well-known visual effects scene. We're known for post-production nowadays for things like the Star Wars movies, as Pinewood has kind of grown and grown. But it's got a rich history of that kind of thing. And I was effectively helping build out pipelines of tools for animators and render farms and things along those lines across film, TV, advertising, up until around about 2009, when I kind of saw a rise in the ability for independent developers to make interesting games. And I just lucked out by meeting one such prominent indie developer at a Christmas party for one of the advertising agencies I was working for. He invited me to my first game jam, and that was when I found out about Unity. Unity had sort of started popping off. It was the first time that you could actually use an engine and deploy across multiple platforms for very little cost. So I started learning Unity. And I actually then went to the BBC, worked at BBC Worldwide Games, and helped ship IP like the Doctor Who games on Facebook, and the Top Gear games as well. And then after that, I wanted to try and have a swing at it myself. So that's where I went into setting up my own studio. With a co-founder. We've grown that. It's not huge. It's a mid-sized studio. Kind of, we have on average around about 14 people in the team at any given time. But we mainly focused on targeting game services for other developers. We were known across the industry, certainly in the UK, for being an R&D and prototyping studio. So we would build UGC tools or tackle hard problems. We would make games about linear algebra for high school kids, where maths teachers could change the game live in the classroom. We would make games about hackers and hacker culture, where they could tell their own stories, things along those lines. So sort of slightly niche, and certainly making use of user-generated content. And I happened to have a friend who was already very deeply into the crypto space, through the London hacker scene, running crypto parties when they meant cryptography rather than cryptocurrency. And so in sort of 2013, 2014, Mustafa Al-Bassam and I, who went on to found Celestia, were teaching journalists how to use PGP, but also how to set up Bitcoin wallets and things like that. And I stayed a skeptic about on-chain games for a very long time, from that point right the way through till kind of 2020 or so. And there are a few things actually that Terrence was much more closely involved in, like the Loot project and what that span out with Dope Wars and Realms, and what we now see as the emerging ecosystem on Starknet, that inspired me to take a second look at the time. So that's where I'm at now.
Nice. Yeah, you're kind of the perfect person to kick this off. The first presentation is really just about from Web2 to Web3. And I feel like you have that background across many different areas within the Web2 space. So maybe we can start pretty broad. How would you describe today's Web2 gaming landscape? Who are the big players right now? And how are they shaping the industry today?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very interesting and also difficult time for Web2 games. Like, it's kind of funny that the point at which I thought that it was an interesting time to shift over to on-chain actually marked the kind of end of explosive growth in Web2 games. So there's a few really good reports out there that describe this in incredible depth. Matthew Ball is one of the kind of contributors to this space that's done a very good job of analyzing both Web2 and Web3. But in one of his reports, he maps out how the growth period from 2011 to 2021 was basically double that of the previous 20 years. So we saw basically 4.5% compound annual growth rate between 1990 and 2010. And then in the decade that we've just been through, it went up to 9.7% CAGR. And that's pretty incredible, not just looking at its own historical benchmarks, but actually against the rest of the world's growth rates. Basically, against real GDP, video games went up 3.4x over that decade. And it's not just because of COVID. They outcompeted every other medium. And obviously, it would be when you use a benchmark like real GDP, it is beating inflation and beating sorts of things that COVID had an effect on. So we've gone from this position of having an explosive marketplace, and then around about 2021, it all started to collapse on itself, and actually video games as a whole had their first year of losses in something like 2 or 3 decades. We saw real-term shrinkage of the video games industry by 3.5% in 2021, and that's against things like films, books, and TV, where we had kind of started laughing about how much bigger we were than them, and they've gone on to be very successful in the last 3 years. So that there's something fundamental has gone on across video games that's been very difficult for it in the last 3 or 4 years, which I think really keys into what you were saying at the beginning, Dylan, whereby there is definitely a turning point, and Web3 has the opportunity to be front and center of that, if done appropriately and reaching players in the right way. Yeah, I can go on, but if you want to kind of ask a question rather than me rambling, that'd be
No, please
fine as
feel free
well.
to ramble. I feel like your rambling is quite interesting to me, and I think your
Yeah,
insights there are quite valuable. Maybe we can briefly unpack a couple different terms,
yeah,
um, especially for people new to the gaming scene. People often talk a little bit about AAA studios,
mm,
mid-sized companies, and particularly on the indie dev side. What does
yeah,
this actually mean? What are
yeah,
these terms, and what are the key differences? I especially would love you to talk a little bit about how indie teams actually build games
yeah,
compared to the larger AAA studios.
yeah, sure. Well, so AAA, this has always been a weird blurred boundary, because we have these terms like AAA and we have double A, and then we have mid-size, which who knows what that really means. And then you have indie, and then we also have triple I, which is supposed to be big indies. And where triple I meets double A, it is quite a confusing kind of realm. Many of the mid-sized studios have done what I did over the last decade, and actually provide services for other bigger games studios. So they maybe are servicing AAA studios with art services, or doing perhaps even prototyping a design like we did. Um, then they will also try and ship their own games, but they're often called double A as a bit of a kind of put down, because they're the same genre with the same mechanics, but not quite made as well. Um, and at the other end of the scale, you have the sort of indie and triple I, whereby indie can be, I suppose I didn't say the size. I mean, so triple A studio can often have at least 1,000 developers in it, and it might have 1,000 developers spread across even 3 to 5 studios globally. So many of these games will have thousands of developers on them at any given time, which helps give a bit of insight as to why like the latest GTA 6 budget is $2 billion.
But it doesn't explain why GTA 6 is not out yet.
Like maybe it does.
Okay,
Actually,
fair.
I can't imagine coordinating those many people. But so when it comes to indie, you go from having a game that is made with thousands upon thousands of people coordinated across several large studios, of sort of 500 to 2,000 people. Indies can be independent, singular people. There are very few one-off individuals that actually make it to shipping a game. Often, you will find that kind of solo auteur will eventually, even kind of just for the last push, get a couple of people around them, like an artist and a sound designer, and maybe even someone that helps them with marketing or go to market. There's a couple. There's a couple who've done it completely on their own. They have genuinely like had breakdowns afterwards. That's how hard video games are. So like anyone in the audience thinking I can do this on my own, I mean, maybe you can with AI now. Maybe that is the difference. But I would still heartily not recommend it for the sanity of yourself and your loved ones.
Yeah. I
And
feel
the
like,
triple, oh, go on. Sorry, Dylan.
oh no, sorry. I just feel like gaming is just a bunch of testing and iteration, and doing it alone is not easy. But
Yeah.
some people have definitely done it, or done it with a couple members of their team, and pushed out really amazing games like Balatro, Hollow Knight, on the indie side too.
Yeah, and I think you're dead right there, right? If you really can stay objective to your audience on your own, and test and fail over and over and over again without going mad, you probably can do it. But most people require a little like outside help and some co-workers to get there. So that's the indie scale of it, right? And in indie, I sit in this weird world where many indies would look at my studio and say it's not indie anymore because there's been over 10 people for a while. But I think it's really hard to define because we're certainly not triple I, which is this weird space where you're making an innovative game that has more like double A qualities. And if you remember, double A was low quality triple A games. Um, so and we're kind of there, but we stick with the kind of plucky, sparky indie style rather than using all of our team to try and club into one kind of specifically high graphic fidelity game with potentially slightly innovative mechanics. We stick to making a couple of smaller games in parallel that are as innovative as we think we can manage the market to be interested in. Hopefully that
Maybe
describes the space.
maybe on that line with the plucky and innovative, I
Hmm.
kind of want to take a broader question, then let's jump back into that area.
Yeah,
AAA studios, they often kind of stick with these proven franchises. It's safer for business. They release
yeah,
sequels or annual titles like Call of Duty or Madden, or sometimes they have, longer release schedules for large franchises like God of War, which is my favorite series of all time. That and
mhm.
Zelda for on the Nintendo side. But a couple questions on this. Do you think that this reliance on familiar IP actually stifles innovation? And if so, does that leave any gap behind with this approach that indie studios can be more plucky and innovative that they're maybe uniquely suited to fill?
Yeah. I think there's sort of a strange halfway house with this. And actually, I gave a talk on Dojo Day in Denver last week, kind of hitting on this point exactly, which is that there is only so much innovation that you can give to any audience. Basically, people like to be fed a whole load of familiarity with their novelty. Um, and statistically, like, although it's not a pure science, like people need to be roughly 95% familiar with something and be given 5% new thing. And you see this across sort of the most successful franchises or hits in any given genre, whether it's film or books or whatever else, like the fact that Star Wars is a whole kind of mashup of very familiar things set in space is a really good example. But when it comes to games, I think we've fallen into the trap of these franchises not knowing how to do that 5% innovation. It's partly because in order to make the same game again at not incredible new cost and regearing, you use the same engine but the same mechanics as well. So largely 100% of the thing feels exactly the same mechanically, and the 5% change can't just be thematic or visual, because then it actually it's just a setting. It doesn't feel like the thing has changed or you're being given anything genuinely novel. So AAA sort of like tied its hands there. Indies seem to have the other side of the problem, whereas they kind of try and be 95% innovative and only 5% familiar. And I think there are a few breakout hits where it genuinely feels totally weird. But if I was to think of the most experimental games of the last 20 years, it's people like Jason Rohrer, who is unknown to pretty much anyone. However, he was Steven Spielberg's games consultant for like the last 10 to 15 years, right? So he's known as this kind of high-end innovator whose own hits are too innovative for an audience. Um, so I'm not sure whether I answered your question there, actually.
No, I think it's a great answer. So, talking about familiarity, innovation, there's also the concept that you were mentioning earlier, Rockstar has infinitely more money and people working on GTA 6 than even, a triple I kind of studio would have for their particular game. So besides these obvious differences, what do you think are some of the unique hurdles that Indeed studios are facing right now that
Yeah.
bigger studios don't even have on their radar?
Well, funnily enough, they're actually facing some of the same problems, which is that since 2021, there's been a massive decline in VC funding and publisher funding because of the amount of failures across games, with the declining market and things like that. So indies have, or smaller studios even have moved to bootstrapping. We for the longest time just funded our own innovation and IP via doing client work and fitting it in between things. Um, the the move there has actually affected AAA as well, right? Like there's been a collapse in AAA studios for the same reason. Some of this comes down to the fact that like the types of things that drove the industry over that booming period were, novel innovations that themselves have dried up. So like free to play and microtransactions and mobile gaming have all kind of closed up because the cost of user acquisition was what was driving that, and that's gone up massively now because of the way that privacy laws have evolved, the way that Apple's policies have changed, which I think are a great thing, but that has had its own severe effect. Like live services, which I guess, even the GTA 5s and possibly 6s of the world, live services themselves are failing. The things that drive big games are failing. And I think no one really knows where to look currently, which is why it's such a unique opportunity for Web3, to do something interesting and innovative. And it has to be different to what we saw in the 2021 wave, where it was slap the word Web3 on top of a conventional game, spend a lot of money, and don't show anyone anything new or interesting.
Nice.
Yeah.
Maybe we can dive into that a little bit deeper. So what exciting opportunities do you actually see, particularly on the indie and mid-size side, that exist today that they may not have been able to do 5 years ago?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just AI alone as a tool set, rather than necessarily as something that's generating your game for you, is a massive upsell and something that's harder for big studios to kind of retroactively work into their processes. So um, it's a catch-22 because most indies are too ambitious anyway, and make or design games that they can't finish. But I think you can afford to find a halfway house there if you've got the experience
Nice.
by leveraging AI tools, things like Cursor. Generated art, still not too keen on myself. I think that you still need to find something unique, and there needs to be human input there. But you can even speed up, your artist's processes that way. I think the economics thing there is that if you can find partners who are willing to invest in your innovation, then you are in a unique position as an indie. Like we said, 50% of indie studios are now bootstrapping because publishers have kind of lost their bottle and VCs don't really know what the model is. So you have this situation where if you can get partners, I mean, like government funding is now actually one of the largest markers for success for indie studios. We've been lucky to have been funded by people like the UK Games Fund, and the BFI, the British Film Institute, and other such cultural institutions for kickstarting some of our games in the first place. We've also done Kickstarters and crowdfunding. All of those things that are kind of show something that's not VC and not publishing, that can get your games started, actually set you up for a different kind of metric for success. And so if you can start that process and then use that to leverage or unlock, a partnership that can give you the war chest for an ambitious innovative game. And by ambitious innovative game, I don't mean a AAA innovative game. I mean an innovative game that is bigger than the classic indie, something that moves into III but stays innovative. I think you have the ability to stand out and market yourself, in a way that puts you ahead of all of the other indies, and it makes you different fundamentally in terms of innovation to AAA. The only other thing that I have a thesis for our studio, which is real big things. I think that like on-chain games give you the ability to do something that has a bridge into reality, that can go beyond money, that gives you, something that is genuinely different with your game and how its communities get to experiment within it. I think that we're moving into big games in kind of what I was saying earlier, but also monetizing open source allows you to have communities who can come in and support the development process in a way that makes your studio bigger, not because it's got more devs inside the team, because it's got more of them in the community. And then things, because I think we are genuinely moving into this innovation stage where we'll stop recognizing games as what everyone thinks of them for the last few decades, and they move into something that's more metagaming, more augmented or alternative realities. And this comes to my last point, which is the thing that it seems has sort of drained or taken the air out of the balloon for video games over the last 3 years since that boom. A lot of it is social video services, and it's funny because you think of some of the things that actually made it boom it made the industry boom in the past was like the ability to partner with Twitch and YouTube streamers and gear your kind of incredibly hilarious physics game with a great personality on live streams. But actually, what's happened is that's sucked people out of playing the games at all anymore. People still do watch the games, but the video games developers make much less money now than they would have. It's not a reason not to have streamers. So you can't go down that kind of protectionist line, but that genuinely kind of starts to move things in the direction where many of your players start by watching a stream about your game and then get distracted by the social feed and end up watching videos about whatever the algorithm is pushing them in the direction of that's probably not anything to do with your game. And so I think there's an area for innovation or challenge there where indies can try and work to do things that do the opposite, that go to these social video services, have some grounding in reality or some very specific niche that they can excite and attract, and actually steal players back from TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, and try and take it in the other direction. And that sounds easier said than done, but yeah, I think it's an opportunity.
Amazing. Well, you heard it here from Rich. Rich, honestly, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights into the world of gaming from Web2 to Web3. It really is great to, it's always great to hear your perspective on where gaming is, what's missing, and the role that we can play going forward. So really appreciate your time.
You're
And
welcome.
yeah, we'll have some Q&A after Terrence's presentation for everyone here. And with that, let's move on to Terrence. Terrence, I'll let you share your screen for your presentation on generational games.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me quickly find this. All right. Are you able to see this?
All
Cool.
good.
All right. Hey, everyone. First of all, great presentation by Rich and Dylan or Fireside Chat there. Super interesting insights. Thank you for that. And thank you for hosting me. And thank you for everyone for joining. Excited to kind of extend on a little bit of the discussion from Rich and Dylan with this idea of generational games. Before I hop in a little bit on myself, I'm Terrence. I'm one of the co-founders of Cartridge. Cartridge is the lead developer of the Dojo toolchain for building fully on-chain games or provable games or autonomous worlds on top of Starknet. My path into the ecosystem started about a little over 4 years or a little over 3 years ago with the creation of Loot and the subsequent project that a friend and myself and a few others in the community launched right afterwards called Dope Wars, which is kind of like a loot. If you're not familiar with Loot, Loot was this idea of an NFT with some items and just some very basic lore attached to it, set in kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons type universe. And Dope Wars was the same thing, set in more of like a GTA kind of universe, inspired by a classic game called Drug Wars, which is a MS-DOS game, or a lot of people played it on calculator. And we created this project and a DAO around it. And one of the goals that we had was to basically recreate this classic game fully on chain. So that means putting, all of the game's logic on a blockchain, so it can live forever. And that kind of effort led us down this pathway to founding Cartridge, to discovering Starknet, building Dojo, and bringing us where we are today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, this idea of generational games. Like in the physical world, we see a lot of them, things like soccer or football, tennis, games that really can just stand the test of time, that can live, forever for literally generations. And how can we kind of recreate those properties of these physical things in the digital world? I think like so far the one of the best attempts at this has been kind of the Warcraft franchise, and I think like Rich was mentioning, there's a lot of the games that people play today are actually like set in universes that were created 10, 20 years ago, and a lot of the experiences that people are still attached to, a lot of the hours that people are playing games are actually still in these classics, and a lot of the AAA kind of the big developer studios are still very focused on kind of optimizing and just shipping these like classic games without much innovation happening around it. So World of Warcraft, or Warcraft, the initial franchise was created in 1994 and expanded into a bunch of different titles ever since then. There's been, a few different attempts. Over time, the game has evolved and there's been different interpretations of the lore. But generally speaking, with Warcraft and many of the games that share, a similar centrally published kind of franchise-based model, what we see is they stagnate over time. Like a lot of the most interesting innovations for these franchises have actually come externally from, kind of indie developers building mods like Dota, or, in the case of Warcraft, that World of Warcraft hardcore mode and stuff like this, that where it's just passionate people in the ecosystem that come and build and experiment and don't have the same incentives as the large publisher and are willing to kind of engage in innovation, creative destruction, to build novel new experiences. But what we typically see, and the reason why these kind of traditional franchises, I believe, are not long-term sustainable, is that in order for those mods or those reinterpretations of them to become successful, they essentially face this. They have to exit the ecosystem and create like a entirely new dependent title. And so is it independent titles. So we see that with, for example, Dota or League of Legends, and there's many other examples of this. So there's really no incentive today for people to kind of to innovate and build new interesting experiences on top of this, like historical lore or universe with a lot of distribution, and you really have a fully top-down controlled ecosystem where the publisher is just incentivized to do incremental improvements, and not push like the barriers and help push the space forward and deliver innovative gaming experiences to their users. And so one of the biggest reasons that these games stagnate is just like once you have, and it's not just games, it's across like almost every industry, is like once you have a breakout success, like your incentive becomes for incremental iteration. Like you want to just protect the cash cow. You don't want to make dramatic changes that potentially will be valuable in the long term and unlock like a new potential for the game, because there is a downside risk to the existing experience. And a lot of times the traditional publishers like kind of transition into this mode of just like value extraction, of like how can we just extract the most value from this game, because that's kind of like the profit motive of these like centralized organizations, and very often that's at the expense of the core game loop. And the permission nature of these creates like very little incentive for others in the ecosystem, modders, or other participants to build and on top of them. In many cases, when people do build interesting things around them, they're shut down by the central publisher. We've seen that in the case of Dota, or GTA just had this with the Liberty City revival. And in the case of World of Warcraft, for example, there's hardcore mode, which created a ton of value for the franchise, but the person that created it ultimately, wasn't able to see a representative amount of that upside. The hardcore mode was just integrated directly into the game, and so without like strong guarantees around like the credible neutrality of the platform itself, there's really no incentive for external developers to build on top of it. There's no upside for them. There's no tractable path to generating sustainable revenue in a robust way, and subsequently there's no ecosystems around it that are willing to fund developers using traditional games as the distribution channel for innovative mechanics. So how can we kind of have the best of both worlds, where we have games that have existing engaged player bases with compelling lore, as well as indie studios or independent developers around them that are willing to take risks and compete with each other to deliver, new innovative experiences to their players. And I think that's really one of the core affordances that on-chain games or provable games really unlocks for gaming ecosystems. You can create games where the full logic and the state and all of the different components, core components of the game live on chain, and it can inherit this property of credible neutrality from the blockchain, as well as the other features like payment rails and composability and interoperability. So you can create a foundation for vibrant ecosystems where you have incentives for people to innovate on top of them, to create novel new experiences, to broaden the set of experiences that players can engage in inside of the universe, and expand it over time in a very emergent way where you can enable things like creative destruction. And the way to do this is by transitioning from a permission model to a permissionless model. And that's exactly what we've set out to do with Cartridge and Dojo on top of Starknet. So I wanted to just walk through a little bit of a case study of a game or an ecosystem in the Dojo Starknet cartridge ecosystem that exemplifies a lot of these properties and is one of, I think, the most robust attempts at doing that today. And that's the Realms ecosystem. So Realms ecosystem was something that launched about 3 years ago with the Loot project, and started down this path of building a fully open source, permissively licensed IP set in the Realms world, and has a DAO that manages a fund and has funded a bunch of different teams building around it, and has a very vibrant community of different teams building a bunch of different experiences around this core lore, and the core assets, and interpreting it in different ways, and really pushing the envelope on innovating in the different ways that you can, and different mechanics that you can put fully on chain. And in particular, inside of Realms is a game called Eternum, which is kind of MMO, an RPG strategy game. And I'll walk through exactly what it looks like to put this type of game fully on chain. So the first kind of step is the primitives, and this, kind of, as Rich mentioned, was the first approach to building Web3 games in 2021. It was just putting things like the character, the NFT on chain, but the core game itself and the experience itself lived off chain. So you can have primitives, there are ERC20 tokens, 721, 1155, that represents the core components of the game. But you really need to go, and there's a lot of examples of this in the Web3 gaming space today, where you just have some on-chain representation of an asset that is supposedly permissionlessly owned, that you actually own, but it derives all its value from some off-chain experience, some off-chain game that the publisher of still fully controls, and in theory could do things to the game that just could entirely remove an asset from it, for example. So even while you still own it on chain, it's completely useless inside of the game. And so we really need to go a step further to enable this idea of this credible neutrality, and enable these types of emergent worlds to start existing fully on chain. We need to remove the centralized component, and in order to do that, we need to make sure that the properties and the attributes of these primitives are fully legible on chain, that you can build logic on chain that extends them into the actual things like the physics of these universes, and imbues with them different attributes like energy, strength, stamina, and mana, as an example. And this is what we saw initially with the Loot ecosystem. So this part on the left here is essentially the initial Loot bags that were minted. As part of it, there's a bunch of different items inside of it. And one of the unique things about it was smart contracts could read the different attributes that were inside of the cards. So it wasn't just an NFT, a picture with a link to a centralized, web hosting service with a picture of this. This was all fully generated on chain. And as subsequently we immediately saw some emergent ecosystem development that happened on top of it, on top of this like kind of lore that was initially created through the loot cards. We saw like adventurers that were a visual interpretation of them, and then people breaking them down into the individual components. And all of this could happen on chain because of this interoperability and legibility of this low-level asset. And the Realms ecosystem built on top of this as well, and they issued NFTs that extended the original loot lore to basically encompass like geographical places inside of the loot universe. And that's where the Realms NFT came into play. And there was further decomposed into a bunch of different resources that each of these realms had. And these are the underlying core primitives that have enabled the development of the game Eternum that we'll continue going through here. And I think like the core insight here is by making all of these components of this lore like fully permissionless and legible on chain, you enable an emergent ecosystem of developers to reinterpret them and incorporate them and break them down into different primitives that can then contribute back to this, the loot universe. And so by making these fully on-chain, you can also do things like making them extensible. So you can add new properties very easily. And this is something that Dojo, which enables, they can be portable, move between these different experiences, and permanent. You have strong guarantees from the blockchain around the credible neutrality of these assets and their properties, that they're never going to change according to anything, some external kind of decision-making process. Like all of that can be embedded fully on chain. And then the third thing is the behaviors. What does it look like? The different interactions between these different attributes, like the interpretation, taking those and incorporating them into like core mechanics inside of games. And we see that in the actual manifestation of different games, such as Loot Survivor, Dope Wars, Eternum, Ponzi Land, and Jokers of Neon. These are a bunch of different games building inside of our ecosystem, where Loot Survivor and Eternum, for example, are actually both inside of the Realms ecosystem, along with a few other games that all are different interpretations, different teams building different games on top of a shared primitive. And so once you have like the primitives, the attributes, and you have like the actual logic of it, like these behaviors, you can start to implement like the physics of this world and govern the interaction between these different assets. Like how are they created? How are they destroyed? What can you do with them? And you start to build, actual game mechanics fully on chain. And you can see that in practice with Eternum, where you can take, if you own a realm, you can initialize this game, you can spawn your realm. It has a bunch of resources available to it. It has a bunch of other entities and types of characters inside of the game. You can build armies, you can battle them, and all of this is fully deployed, like fully on-chain and extensible and interoperable, and allows anyone to build on top of it and to continue evolving that. And that's something that we've seen as well in practice during Eternum Season 0, where other people have built, for example, clients or different extensions to the client in order to optimize their gaming experience. And we've seen it in other games in the ecosystem as well, with projects such as Loot Survivor or Eternum, where essentially having this fully open source API around your game allows people to build different clients and different ways of interacting with it, and different ways of experiencing it that can be positive sum for everyone. You can, contribute back to it in a positive sum way, and you can receive some exposure to the upside of creating these novel new interpretations or games that are inside of these ecosystems. So what does it look like to build, these types of games, these generational games that can live forever? Once you have them fully on chain, you have essentially like these public goods that can be stakeholder governed according to a process that's defined fully on the blockchain. They can be extensible, interoperable, You have fully on-chain assets, and that enables extensibility, allows people to build new experiences, new interpretations around it. You have this ability for multiple different teams to engage in different world building around like the core IP and create different experiences with different go-to-market distribution strategies. And when they're successful around that and leveraging that core IP as like the distribution channel, they can permissionlessly participate in the upside. And I think like overall, like this emergent approach to world building and building fully on-chain games is going to allow us to build like much more robust, more enduring experiences for players. And I think we've seen that with Eternum already so far, is people, when you have a game fully on chain, people have like a very strong attachment to it, and you can create like games at a very high stake that people are very engaged in, particularly because they might have like some exposure to the assets. And Eternum Season 0, uh, the biggest problem that people had was that they cared so much about this game that they kind of got lost and had no time for family or all the other, life's responsibilities because they were just playing this game 24/7. So what's stopping us from making these games today? A few years ago, there was a bunch of challenges. We've since solved a lot of them. We have a pretty vibrant ecosystem now inside of Dojo, Starknet, Cartridge, with a bunch of different teams building different types of experiences, some inside of shared universes like Realms, and some building like new lore and new independent games. We have a tool chain that we've developed with Dojo and Cartridge that facilitates solving a lot of these problems. We'll have, I believe, a session later that digs in more deeply on the technical components of this and provides a walkthrough. But at a high level, you have the Dojo world, the provable logic. You implement like the backend of your game in Cairo. You have Sozo, the toolchain, the development toolchain for deploying and managing the on-chain world. Katana for sequencing, an automatic indexer with Tori, and the settlement orchestrator, and then a bunch of technologies from Cartridge focused on providing great user experience, abstracting a lot of the overhead traditionally associated with the blockchain, and then allowing you to bring games to market quickly using the shared infrastructure of the blockchain. So the controller, slot, paymaster, arcade, explorer, and VRF. And you can learn more and check out all of these things at dojoengine.org or cartridge.gg. I'll end here real quick with just kind of what, from a technical perspective, the architecture looks like. You have a world that can exist on a layer like Starknet, and then in order where the assets of the world itself can live, and then the game experiences themselves can take advantage of this fractal scaling architecture to provide performance very similar to Web2 performance that players expect through execution sharding. So you can operate your game on different execution shards or layer threes that have very low latency and high performance, and are very cheap and enable kind of the computation necessary for these experience, and then use zero knowledge proofs and Starks and Cairo to efficiently prove the integrity of the computation, that these experiences follow the mechanics and the physics of the game, and verify them on chain, and potentially have some interaction with the economic layer on top of it. And because this is all built end to end on top of blockchain technology with Ethereum underneath, you have these very robust guarantees around the credible neutrality and the persistence and the interoperability and the extensibility that is necessary to create these new types of emergent bottoms-up built universes versus kind of the traditional top-down approaches from before. So that's my presentation. I hope that was interesting for you all. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out.
Amazing. Terrence, thank you so much. I'm going to bring you back up here. I'll let you, I'll take the screen from you. Or actually, perfect. Rich, Terrence, honestly, thank you so much. I could not have asked for better people to start off this initiative. Let's just open it up to Q&A. We got around 10 minutes. There's a few questions right here. Um, Actually, I think Rich, this one's for you. It was happening during our fireside. I think it's a good question. What do you recommend for a small studio to start with an oversaturated indie industry where over 40 titles per day launch in Steam? What genre, what market, and what other options to publish besides Steam and Epic are there in Web3?
That's a
It's a
hard
bit, it's
question.
a loaded question right there.
Yeah, I mean, finding partners that are interested in innovation is your first go-to, right? And so I'm very lucky to have had Terrence bring me into the Starknet ecosystem, and had the support of you guys at the foundation and the tooling that Terrence and his teams have been making. So I mean, I would say go and find someone like that that will help you support the ambition of your idea. You've got to obviously come up with an idea that matches their ambition or kind of aligns with it. If you're just talking purely Web 2, how do you innovate within Web 2? I think we've reached this point where it's very hard to know, actually. The kind of idea of 40 indies launching a day has only been going up on something like Steam. If you're launching a Web3 game, you can't launch it on Steam. There's still this kind of sort of set of policies around the incumbent platform holders that block your kind of natural means of distribution. Epic Store is slightly different, but the market share of Epic Store is significantly smaller. I'm not giving you any advice here, am I? I I don't really know. Just innovate. Like I've always run a risky studio, and we've always liked to take risks and do interesting things, and that's usually served us really well. In fact, this is a piece of advice that is useful. Target a niche that you love and that you know that there is an impassioned community around, and not just for a game genre, but something outside of the game genre, because then you have a sort of dual marketing opportunity. You can reach people who are interested in X niche subject and people who are interested in games about X niche subject. And you can create a flywheel of a conversation. It gives you the ability to go to other social platforms and engage and start conversations and things along those lines. And generally speaking, games that are niche tend to outperform anyway, because they are looking to take a larger chunk of a smaller piece of pie, and they tend to dominate that.
Nice. That's a great answer. Let's move on to another question from Mathis. I think this is a great question. He just posted this 6 minutes ago. It's related to user-generated content and how do you see it evolving in gaming? And then maybe specifically, how can studios actually encourage communities to actively build and expand on their games, especially in a fully on-chain environment?
Who do you want to take that? Because Terrence probably got just as good an opinion as me on this one.
I think I mean, I think like the kind of prerequisite for user generated content really has to be like an initially successful game. So I see a lot of teams trying to lead with UGC as the value proposition, but I think in many cases you need to well, I think like two things. Like one is you need to have like some successful IP to be like the distribution channel for this UGC to incentivize people to actually build UGC. I also think that like blockchain games are inherently like friendly to UGC. It could be user generated content, or it could be any kind of type of developer that wants to contribute to them because they're fully open source and interoperable and can deployed on a blockchain. I think the incentives will naturally be there for on-chain games. Like if you have a successful IP that has good distribution, people can build experiences on top of it using something like Dojo, and they can very easily participate in the upside of the experience that they built because there's native payment rails and stuff like that built directly into it. So I think there will be like an inherent incentive for people to do that once you have a successful IP.
Nice. I think we might have time for one more question. We can go through the chat right now, see which one is probably the best one. Um, I think this is actually a really good one for both you, Terrence and Rich. Rich, you were talking a little bit about uh, Twitch streaming and how it potentially impacted how people actually play games or lack thereof playing games. And Jan has a question that even it's surprising, and I'm quoting, surprising that even though the internet has become more accessible over the last couple of years, online gaming slash video games, etc., has declined. Any insight on what has driven this trend? So, Rich, you did mention the streaming side, but maybe there's a few other things. Is it related to gamer fatigue? Is it related to microtransactions associated with mobile games? Curious your thoughts and where we can improve going forward.
Yeah, I think some of it like leans into a sort of social connection or longing for social connection. We kind of live in this sort of massively online world, and yet people do feel more disconnected from each other than ever in many different ways. And so the reason that a lot of people gravitate towards personalities and YouTube streamers is because they actually feel like they know the person, and it kind of replaces an anxiety or a social anxiety for many people. Online games used to do that, but I think people have started to feel like they're taking themselves away from those kinds of social engagements that are outside of a given game, and actually maybe on-chain games will solve this because half the problem is you can get really into a community in an online game in Web2, and one day the developer can make it disappear. So I think I think some of this comes down to those kinds of questions. But that's kind of a bit of a fluffy answer. It's just a sentiment that I have.
Fluffy answers are just as valuable as answers with deep level of evidence and backed up statistics and figures, especially from someone who's been as deep in the gaming space as you are. Um, Maybe there's a couple other questions that we can do if we have a little bit more time. What defines a successful game right now on Starknet? Is it number of users? Yeah, fluffiness is underrated. Is it number of users? Is it the tech stack that is used? Is it the business model? How do you define what is successful for a video game?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's very early. I mean, I think traditionally success looks like orders of magnitudes more um, bigger than what like suggests success in the on-chain context looks like right now. I think like one of the core components that's interesting about blockchain games is you can have a much smaller audience that is much more engaged and willing to spend a lot more money. I think ultimately, success for a self-sustaining organization has to be around, some level of monetization and profit, like to fund the continued development of the ecosystem. How that is distributed amongst like the different participants in kind of the value chain, I think is still very experimental. I think like it's just way too early to understand like, what, I mean, I think like at a high level, success is obvious, right? Like success is like people are playing your game and it's generating revenues and it's a sustainable organization. But as far as like how that is achieved is still relatively unclear. And there's a lot of different experiments around different business models around, is it selling NFTs? Is it transaction revenues from, sequencing fees? Is it like meta things around the game, like prediction markets and stuff like that, where that are interesting for capturing value? I think there still remains a lot of experimentation to figure out, like, what exactly is a successful path.
Yeah, I think the hard thing to answer there is the kind of the strict kind of data answer. But if I can add some more fluffiness again, one of the things that I think is really impressive about on-chain games communities, and Terrence sort of touched on it there, and I'd phrase it slightly differently, is the ability to get to your sort of 1,000 true fans. That's a thesis around kind of how you deploy and develop a community that breeds success in the long run. And I mean, we see some other interesting phenomena around that 1,000 true fans that you haven't seen before, where in the Realms ecosystem, actually many of those 1,000 true fans move kind of seamlessly between the games in the ecosystem. There's this sort of shared audience kind of that occurs between games rather than sort of franchises or sequels or developers, and games that often have tangential relationships rather than direct ones. And I think that's fascinating, and it shows kind of potentially a different route to market and a different route to distribution, which is actually something that we're kind of exploring quite closely ourselves.
Amazing. So I know we're a little bit over time, but there are a few other questions. If you guys have time to answer maybe one more, and then we can finalize this. Um, Carla asks actually a very interesting question, and I'm quoting, and this is a little bit beyond just gaming in gaming development. Carla writes, I think as developers, we have a responsibility on the unintended consequences of our dApps in games in terms of mental and physical health. What do you think we can do to add well-being instead of taking it away from our users?
Yeah, I saw that
Very
question
philosophical
actually.
question there.
I really like that question too, and I think it sort of touches a little bit on some of the things we've all touched on. So I think that we have this opportunity where we can actually draw players into the real using blockchain, right? So it's an astounding amount of players who actually play games for reasons outside of the games themselves. Often players will report wanting to play a game because they want to learn about the subject matter or the history in more depth. Or they will want to learn even a technical skill, something like programming in a programming game or logic game. And that's a fairly large proportion, but I think blockchain can take it a lot further. I think we can take games that step you out into actually interacting directly with communities that those things are based on, and that can mean all kinds of things. And so if you bound that into what I was talking about earlier, where we were talking about how social video platforms, which we know are kind of bad for people's mental health, the kind of ability to flick through 30-second videos kind of for hours and not really know where you've been. I think we can do kind of a tie-in with on-chain games that kind of take those audiences who have an interest in a particular area on social video platforms and bring them into games that then tie them directly into the reality of the communities that they're interested in, that then have some kind of direct impact, whether financial or otherwise. And I think that's where people start to feel healthy, when they actually feel like they have agency over the things that they care about. So I think we're actually in a unique realm and opportunity, especially if we can learn to not have the limiting metaphor of money applied to every time we think about an on-chain game, but actually value in a broader sense, which cryptographic kind of proving can be very much a useful method and leverage for.
Perfect. Um, there's so many good questions. I honestly wish we can get to every one of them, but Rich, Terrence, thank you once again. Maybe final words from you guys before I pass it on to just preview next week. Can you just quickly share where the viewers can reach you and learn more about what you're building?
Definitely. So if you want to learn more about Cartridge, you can check it out cartridge.gg or dojo at dojoengine.org. Or you can reach out to me directly. I'm on Twitter, /Terrence VA. I believe there's a comment with it shared in the comments here, in the comment section. Yeah, definitely feel free to reach out if you are interested in exploring the ecosystem more. And thank you for having me. Good luck to everyone with the Terraform program.
And you can find me on the links in the chat. So that's x.com/autonomy, spelt in a very weird way. So I'll leave you to read it, or archetypal tech. And you can catch me kind of building things on Dojo with Terrence, really, and in the cartridge stack. So I'll catch you around. Everyone who's interested in making games on Starknet and on Dojo, go for it. I love it there.
Make it happen. Thanks, guys. So next week, we'll be covering the building Web3 gaming ecosystems in session 2. If you'd like to start learning how to build on Starknet and in Web3, then we'd also suggest joining another program we run called Basecamp 12. Basecamp is the best way to get up to speed with the Starknet stack. Anything from architecture, tooling, literally anything you might need. Basecamp 12 starts on April 3rd, and Cartridge will actually be hosting a bonus session on May 1st. I'll see you all next week for Building Web3.